Hi everyone, welcome to lecture 15. In this lecture, I'm talking about loops, and this is our first lecture that talks about loops. This is something that is extremely important to programming. It's a fundamental programming technique. So if we define loops, loops are essentially a fundamental programming technique that are used in writing programs. A loop is a sequence of instructions that are repeated until a certain condition is reached. So this might not make perfect sense to you right now, but when we start writing loops, this will you will be able to picture this actually. Okay, so before we get started, this is the loop structure, and we have talked a little bit about flowcharts earlier. This is saying that the program starts, it goes and tests a condition, and if that condition is true, we know how to write conditional statements, right? So if that condition is true, then I'm asking my program to do something, and then if not, go out. So we are familiar with this structure when we talked about if and if else, right? The only difference here though is that once my condition is true, then I would enter the body of the loop now. Now the loop is a set of repeated instructions. What will happen is that this body will be executed again and again. As you can see, this arrow goes out and then tests the condition again, and then execute the same body again, and so on. So basically, I'm asking my program to repeat a set of instructions until this condition is met. That's what a loop does in general. In today's lecture, and of course, why do we loop? Because repetition is an integral part of any program. And generally, we will be using this to access and modify information in a list, and this will allow us to repeat a block of code. And this is generally required for more sophisticated programming tasks, right? That is why we loop. In this lecture, I'm talking about while loops, but definitely there are more types of loops. Throughout the course, we'll talk about two types of loops. The first one is the while loop that I'm discussing in today's lecture, and the second one is the for loop. Before we talk about the differences, let's go and look at what while loop does. Now, this is how a while loop looks like. It's used to run a block of code repeatedly until a given condition is satisfied. So unless that condition is satisfied, my loop will keep on executing, is what this means, right? And the moment the condition is met, my execution comes out, as you can see here. So the first thing that happens is go and test the condition, which is this arrow, right? If it is true, go and execute the block of code and then loop back and so on. The moment this condition becomes false, go out. Maybe there is another set of code that needs to be executed, or the program needs to stop, depending on what we want our program to do. Now, just like any other Python syntax, in this syntax, in while loop syntax, we need to be sure of the indentation, because Python will use indentation as its method of grouping statements. Again, if this doesn't make a lot of sense to you right now, we will just go quickly to Spider and check how we write our very first while loop. Okay, so the way we write while loop, and I'll be commenting that as well, is initialize. That's our first step. And then the second step should be condition. The third step should be the body of the loop. That must include increment or decrement. Now let's see. Suppose I'm trying to print numbers from 1 to 10. Obviously, from our current knowledge, I can just go and say print 1 and then print 2 and so on, right? But this kind of seems to be a very tedious method if I'm trying to print, let's say, numbers 1 to 100, right? And for this task, I need to write a loop. Now, the way I'll write a loop is, and if you go back and check my comments, I need to initialize my loop. So I will initialize my variable, and I can name it anything. I'm naming it I, and I need to begin from 1. So I need to print my numbers from 1. Initialization is the step where you'll give the first thing from where your loop should begin, right? So that's your first statement. And then comes the while statement. That's a keyword, right? And then I would write my conditional statement. We are familiar with what conditional statements are. So I'm saying while I is let's say less than equal to 20. So I'm trying to print numbers from 1 to 20, not from 1 to 100. While this condition is met, and until it's not met, go and keep doing something. For example, I'm saying go and print I. Unless my I becomes 20, keep going keep printing this I, right? Now, the issue here is that my I is, I've already assigned it a value I equals 1, so that would be printed here. But then I need to print I equals 2, I equals 3, I equals 4, and that's where the idea of loop comes in. So I will be doing an increment to my I. I'll say I plus equals 1. With every increment, my I would be printed, and then the value of I would change, right? So it will become I equals 2, I equals 3 until it becomes 20. And the moment it becomes 20, my execution would stop. So this is the condition, and this is the body. This is the increment and the decrement. So do not forget these three parts of a while loop whenever you're writing a while loop. Try to remember it using this. And let's execute it. And as you can see, I have numbers from 1 to 20, right? Again, another example of a while loop could be that there is a list, and we are familiar with lists. So there are lists, and I need to read these values and do something with them. Let's say I just need to print them, right? Loops are especially useful when you're trying to access these iterables and then do something with them. Let's say manipulate them, right? So in this case, I would write a loop, and again, the first thing would be initialize. Again, name it as any variable I equals 0, and then I would say while I less than. Now I need to go and print all these elements, and I don't want to use my print statement again and again, right? I don't want to type it, but I want my loop to do that for me. So the best way I can do is, I know I have to access each of these elements, right? And then this element is at position 0, this is at position 1, 2, and so on, right? The length of this list, however, is 1 more than the index position of 7, right? We know that already from our knowledge of lists. So I can say length of L, right? So while I stays less than length of L, strictly less than length of L, why? Because with I am trying to point to the indices of these things. Here, I is nothing but 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So I'm trying to access these values, right? And I'm saying go and print L and then I. Why? Because I is the index of my list. Let me write it here. Print the elements of a list. And this is something basic to any loop. Go and print that, and remember, I did my initialization, I did my condition, I did the body of the loop. Now the only thing that's remaining is my increment or decrement, right? So let me do that. I plus equals 1. Let's see if it prints my elements in my list, right? So it does 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So it goes up to length L, but because length L is 1 greater than the index of 7, so obviously I said strictly less than length of L. So that's the basic of using a while loop. Remember, you should always initialize, condition, and then increment or decrement. Another example using the same list is that I might want to print my elements in reverse order. So this is just to show you the decrement part. Print the elements in reverse. Let me show you that. So I'm having the same list L, and let's say, like, instead of I can name my variable J. That's up to you, whatever you like. Now I can say while J is greater than or equal to, because I will begin actually with not 0 here. I will begin with the length of L, right? And I'll go down. So I'll begin from here. While J is length of L and minus 1. Why? Because I'm indexing, I'm using J to index, right? So there is no length of L index. There is, however, this index length of L minus 1. And we know from our knowledge of lists why, right? So go and keep printing L of this J, right? Because this J is nothing but the index. And then keep decrementing that index. So I'll say minus equals 1 instead of like, or you can write like, it's up to you. You could just say J equals J minus 1. It means the same thing. And I think we've talked about that also a couple of times. So let's go and run this to check. So as you can see, it's printing things in reverse order, right? So this is that condition that I talked about here, increment or decrement. So it depends on what you're trying to do with your while loop. Now, one thing to remember with the while loop is that if you forget somehow this increment or decrement condition, if somehow something happens in this part, especially this part here, and this I is not changing, this would enter into something called an infinite loop. And this is specific to while loops, and we have to be extremely, extremely careful when we are doing while loops. Let me show you what that means. Let's say I'm trying to print hello world some times. I'm saying, so the first step is count equals 0, initialize, and then let me just like scroll it down so that it's clear. And this is another example of infinite loops, right? So these are important when we're writing while loops. Be extremely sure that your loop is not entering into an infinite loop. I'm saying while count is less than 10, and I'm trying to print something, let's say hello world 10 times, right? So I'm trying to say just go and print hello world, and let me run this. Now see what's happening on the right hand side, right? I would just stop it for now using this stop the current command. What's happening here is that it's going into an infinite loop because I haven't specified what should happen to count, right? My count is 0 and I'm saying go and print hello world, and then the condition is count until count remains less than 10, keep printing that. And because my count is not changing, it's always less than 10, right? So this is an infinite loop. Make sure that you do not enter into infinite loops when you're doing while loops. Okay, so then in this case, the missing condition was count plus equals 1, right? So eventually it would reach to 10, and then my loop would come out of my infinite loop, right? So this was pretty much about while loops. In the next lecture, I'll be talking about for loops, which is kind of an extension and a better way of writing loops, and we'll discuss that in the next lecture. Thank you.